Good morning. My name is Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together Queensland. I'll be conducting today's superannuation briefing for members in schools. We'll be trying to keep the session to finish just before 11 o'clock. We had a couple of technical issues with a slight delay in the start today, and I apologise for that. And we will have the chat online, but we won't be able to check all of the commentary in relation to the chat process, given the presentation will be occurring at the same time. So I think we've got a number of people now online, so we'll kick it off. Once again, my name's Alex Scott. I'm the branch secretary of Together Queensland. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today you should be also hopefully seeing the PowerPoint screen. If there's any problems with the technology, you can put that up, but there'll also be an opportunity after today to, there'll be a follow-up email with other further questions that people have in relation to superannuation. So in terms of today, before I find right, before we kind of go through the detailed changes, I thought it'd be worth talking through exactly where we've come from in terms of public sector superannuation to try and provide a better understanding of what's happening and why in terms of that process. So in terms of that, we want to cover a bit of what's happening in terms of the Commonwealth legislation, as well as the history of the public sector legislation and looking at what that's going to mean in relation to processes. Today, I'll be talking primarily about Q-Super as the terminology I'll use. Q-Super itself has recently amalgamated with SunSuper to form the Australian Retirement Trust is the formal name of the broader superannuation fund, but for the purposes of most public sector workers, you'd still be using the terminology, which is the brand that they're using within the public sector, which talks about Q-Super. You also have, with these changes, previously or had the ability to take your superannuation investments elsewhere rather than just Q-Super. So these changes will apply to anybody in terms of their superannuation, irrespective of which fund they're in. So in terms of Q-Super, the fund arrangements that apply to public sector workers are set by legislation. There is a trust deed in place that has been there for over a century, which talks about a range of changes to how your super is managed. And in terms of that process, what we'll be trying to work through is what's going to happen in terms of what the employer has been doing in relation to Q-Super. So in terms of the history of superannuation, in terms of the private sector, this superannuation has been around for 30 years or so in terms of compulsory super, but superannuation in the public sector has been around for a lot longer. So it's been around for kind of beginning of last century. Primarily white-collar public servants had superannuation, and that super scheme had various names to it, but was primarily a scheme that involved the employee and the employer putting in money, and then the employer providing a pension equivalent to a pension product at the end of retirement. So there's the age pension by the Commonwealth government, but public servants had forced retirement, both from employer and employee contributions, which provided a pension product available to people upon retirement in addition to the age pension. That then changed about 30 years ago to being a move from a pension product to a lump sum payment. So that was a significant shift, and that's when the brand Q-Super was originally created. State Super was the kind of scheme that existed for the pension product. The new product was a defined benefit scheme. And that was once again different and predated the kind of the private sector schemes that have more recently emerged, which was that rather than a pension for life and the kind of risks for government in terms of what that looked like in terms of a funding model, they moved to what was a defined benefit scheme. And that defined benefit scheme still had a number of people in the public sector in it. About 10% of the workforce are still in a defined benefit scheme. It's no longer available for new starters, and you can't join it if you're new to the system. But those people who were in it would maintain that capacity to stay in it. And that was a scheme that was defined that will give you a lump sum based on the guarantee that your lump sum when you're retired would be based on your final salary by your number of years of service by a quote factor of 0.21. So if you were there for 20 years on $100,000, you'd get $400,000, being $20,000 by 10 years by 0.21. And that was a guaranteed lump sum. And that was based on service and salary rather than investment returns. And so therefore the state government was therefore taking the risk in relation to that in terms of that process, but also it had very differential outcomes for workers. For those people who got promotion a lot during their time in the public sector, it was a very attractive scheme because as your salary went up, the return went up as well. But for those people who had salary increases but didn't change classification as much, they were effectively subsidising those people with high classification changes. And so therefore, there was a significant variation in relation to whether or not the defined benefit scheme was advantageous. The Queensland public sector was lucky in this regard in that the state government was putting money aside for it. And so therefore, what was known as a fully funded scheme, in that the scheme was had more money than actuarially assessed to make those payments as they became due. Other states and the Commonwealth didn't do that, and they were then just giving the money to people upon retirement based on their kind of year by year process. And they were then what was called unfunded schemes because those schemes didn't have the ability to necessarily have enough money in the super scheme to pay what was going to be future debts. And the government of the day in Victoria and New South Wales and the Commonwealth had to top up to make sure those schemes remained viable. That didn't happen in Queensland, but Queensland still wanted to be in a situation of reducing the risks of that process and moving the risk from the employer to the employee in relation to that process, and introduced what was then called the accumulation scheme about 20 years ago, which was part of an extension also from the smaller numbers of the white-collar workers to larger parts of the public sector being blue-collar workforce as well. And that was a more traditional scheme as we currently understand superannuation, which is that the monies were invested in the name of the person, and that person then had the benefit of how that fund then was invested. So if there was very high returns, all those returns went to the employee. If there were low returns, the employee suffered from those lower returns, which was different to the defined benefit, which was that if the returns were very high, the employer kept that money. But if the returns were low, the employer still had to top up the scheme. And what was happening under the defined benefit scheme was that the returns were much higher than kind of in the modelling, and so the scheme built up a surplus in the defined benefit scheme because of the fact that the returns were higher than what the government was guaranteeing through the scheme to provide that retirement benefit. So for about 10% of our membership, particularly longer term employees, they are still in the defined benefit scheme. And most of the changes that are being announced by government in the last couple of weeks are available to defined benefit members if they choose to opt out of the defined benefit scheme and into the accumulation scheme. But for members in the accumulation scheme, these changes will come through. There's a question about timing, but they are going to come through. And they have some significant variations to this. But one of the key things, as the super system evolved from the pension to the defined benefit scheme to the accumulation scheme, was that the question was moved away from salary definitions to kind of an accumulation process. But under the defined benefit scheme, shift workers who have significant variations in terms of their salary on a week-to-week, fortnight-to-fortnight basis, depending on what shifts they work, didn't have that kind of variable shift component of their salary included in the super scheme because of the defined nature of it, and saying your annual salary was going to be the determinant as people's salary ebbed and flowed in relation to the shifts they work. That was excluded from the defined benefit scheme. And as those negotiations then occurred to move from the defined benefit scheme to the accumulation scheme and broaden the base of the fund, that definition of excluding shift penalties was significant and continued into the accumulation scheme, where at that point in time, the private sector through the award system and then the superannuation guarantee levy was expanding in terms of becoming the norm for Australian workers to have superannuation, and that Commonwealth legislation included shift penalties. And that's a significant impact, not so much for members in schools, but in health and other places. Up to a third of their salary is in those shift penalties, and that wasn't being superannuated in the public sector, where in the private sector, into the superannuation guarantee levy, it was being it was being provided. So in terms of most of the public sector, in terms of the accumulation scheme, the position currently is, which has now been announced for changes, but currently is that the employer, when you start, puts in 12.75% for your salary as defined non-shift, and then you are required to put in 5%. And so therefore you get 17.75% of your equivalent of your salary going into building up a retirement benefit for you. If you choose not to have the full 5% contribution and you want to have less contribution rates, if you can drop yours from 4 to 3 to 2, but if you do that, the employer drops their contribution from 11.75 to 10.75 to 9.75. So there is every percentage drop you reduce your contribution rates, the employer matches it. So effectively, you're dropping your rate by 2% for every 1% you choose not to do. So in terms of that, when that scheme was being developed, that's where it kind of evolved to. But concurrently, over the last 20 years, the private sector has had superannuation introduced. Originally, there was no superannuation for most workers kind of 40 or 50 years ago, limited to public sector and a couple of large employers, banks and a few other places. But since then, about 34 years ago, the award system started to introduce superannuation as part of discussions about the national wage case during the Hawke-Keating government. The unions were able to negotiate for private sector workers the introduction of award superannuation, which was originally a 3% and then a second 3% contribution to superannuation, which was a trade-off for the national wage case award changes that occurred under that period. And then towards the end of the Hawke-Keating governments, there was a move to move that out of the award system into legislation, because the award system covers the majority of workers, but not everybody. And then the Hawke-Keating governments then introduced and significantly increased the superannuation rates, but didn't do it as part of the industrial process, but required by legislation that the superannuation would be then set at 9%, but also said that because they were seeking to remove their liability for the age pension, they were keen to get people into superannuation. So originally it started at 9%, and then there was legislation that was passed saying they would step it up over time. And it was originally going from 9% to 12% over quite a short period of time. Then successive governments put off the final increases. And so the legislation existed to move from 10 to 12% over 3-year periods, but that 3-year period kept on getting moved by successive Commonwealth governments because they couldn't get the numbers to abolish the change, but they just kept on putting it off and off and off. And just before the last election, the Morrison government once again tried to put off the implementation of the final 3% change to superannuation in the private sector through the Commonwealth legislation, and they were unsuccessful to do that. So we've now seen from 1 July last year, 2021, it moved to 10%, and then moved once again by another 0.5% 1 July this year, and moved to 12% by 1 July 2025. So we can see that in terms of that relativity, what that was meaning was that we were going to be by July 2025, the employer was going to be faced with the fact that in the public sector, they were saying to public servants that you need to put in 5%, and we will then out of their generosity, they'll be provided 12.75 by an employer contribution. That looks like a good deal when private sector alternative was 6%. But by 2025, it was going to get to a compulsory contribution of 5% for the employee, and the employer putting in 12.5%, of which only 0.75% was discretionary, because the reality was the federal legislation was going to push it up to 12%. The federal legislation only partially covers the state government because of the defined benefit nature of the historical parts of the Q Super Fund. There were some exemptions provided for the state government, and that one of those exemptions was around shift work. And so the one exemption was that the employer had to give you, for shift workers, had to give 12.75 on base rate. But if your superannuation, including shift workers, shift work was greater than 12.75, they had to make up that difference. And so there was a kind of calculation that's been done. When originally at 3%, at 9%, the differential between the 9% and the 12.75 meant that nobody was picking that up. But as it got closer to 12%, that was going to become more and more of an issue. So one of the major changes that the government's announced in relation to superannuation that doesn't really apply to members in schools was that they were going to move the calculation of the 12.75 to include shift work. That's a big change over the next couple of years, in particular, because of the fact that that will mean for health workers and a range of other groups who were previously under superannuated compared to the rest of the sector, their full salary will now be included in that process. And that will be both for the 12.75 and the 5% calculation. Once again, though, because of the defined benefit nature of the scheme, for those people, that wasn't going to apply for defined benefit members, only for those people in accumulation, because it was a prospective change rather than a respective change, and the way that the fund has been modelled in terms of making sure it was viable. Changing it for in defined benefit would have meant a significant hit to the fund, and it would have potentially moved the fund, which currently is in surplus, potentially at risk. And that would have put the benefit for annual retirement benefit for everybody else in the defined benefit scheme at risk by introducing it just for shift workers. But the other major change for public sector workers outside of shift workers has been that the government has recognised that their situation in relation to the ability to require a co-contribution from employees is going to become more and more untenable as the minimum rate for the private sector and for the rest of the system in Australia moves up to 12%. So by 2025, we would have had the situation where there was 12.75 plus 5, and in the private sector, it was 12% for no co-contribution. So the government has announced as part of these changes that they will remove the requirement for that 5%. Everybody will continue to get 12.75 on their super, but later this year, all workers, shift workers or non-shift workers in the accumulation scheme will have the option of changing their model in terms of that process. So you'll have the option of I can put in 0% and still got 12.75. At the moment, if I put in 2%, I would only be getting 9.75. So that kind of link between the employer dropping their contribution rate, if you drop your contribution rate, will be removed. In terms of that, what that will then mean is that potentially all members will have the option, if they're in the accumulation scheme, of saying, I would like to manage my own finances differently. I can either have a situation where the status quo remains, which is 17.75% of my salary equivalent goes into my pre-retirement benefit and for planning for the future, or I can drop that back from 17.75 down to 12.75, or a mix somewhere in between the two, with my own contributions as a worker being 0 to 5, meaning whether I get to 12.75 or 17.75. Most of the modelling shows that 12.75 isn't going to be enough for a comfortable retirement benefit for workers, but that's going to be a very individual choice. So this change will give you more control over your finances. Whether that's something you want to exercise is really going to be a matter of individual choice and individual circumstances. How much in terms of the current situation do you want a 5% increase in take home in terms of the salary that you get on a fortnightly basis, and at the loss of the size of your retirement benefit? So where you are in terms of your current financial situation, how difficult it is to make ends meet at the moment, particularly in light of the significant increase in costs with CPI running at 6% in Brisbane or Queensland at the moment, compared to that situation versus how much money you need to have both on an individual level and or potentially a family level for retirement is going to be significant. And certainly for a younger worker, dropping that 5% to 0 will have a more significant change on their retirement benefit, but their retirement is a lot further away. So in terms of that process, that is really going to be the significant choice that you don't currently have, that you will soon have in terms of that process. In terms of timing of it, the government has 3 major payroll providers: one health, one education, and the rest of the public service. So the exact timing of when this happens in schools is going to be subject to a discussion about the practical ways that QSuper as the main super provider, or ARD as it now is, the main super provider, can manage this process. but also in terms of the ability of education payroll to be able to manage this change in terms of that process. So we think that's likely to happen in education before potentially health, because health is a lot more complicated in their arrangements. They have a lot more shift workers who are going to be more substantially impacted by this process in terms of those changes. But in terms of that process, we also will be the other choice that workers will have to make is that because this is prospective rather than retrospective, it also won't be available for defined benefit members. If you're currently in defined benefit and want to drop your 5% contribution, you'll have to roll your defined benefit into the accumulation scheme, which is an option you already have, and then change it at that point in time. So for workers, it will depend about where you think the market's going to be for if you want to move from defined benefit versus accumulation. But there are a range of parts, kind of interrelated parts into that in terms of the kind of combination of your current salary, your age, your projected retirement benefit, and also where you might have other investments or other superannuation, are those things. And so you're going to need to get individual financial advice in that regard. But the main thing will be you now have a choice you didn't previously have. You'll have more control over the financial choices you make. You won't be mandated to 5%. But also the employer will contribute 12.75 no matter what you contribute to your superannuation scheme. You'll be required to do it under the accumulation scheme. If you want to do that in your defined benefit, you'll need to swap funds and swap structures. But then it will be an opportunity moving forward. So we haven't got final dates yet for when this will happen in education. We're in discussions with all three payroll providers to get some clarity around those dates. But we would hope to have that in the near future. But we would certainly be saying this isn't something people should rush into. Their retirement benefit is a significant factor in terms of their long-term financial planning, and you need to get individual advice around that. And we'd certainly be encouraging everybody to consider an option you didn't previously have, but also when you are considering it, to get the best possible advice. So we will do some follow-up in relation to this process and keep you fully informed. There'll also be an email coming out for everybody online today asking them their views on what this looks like, but also asking your views about how this presentation went, because it is quite a complicated issue, and we are trying to find the best way of discussing it with members. So for those people who are online, you will get, if you can take the time to give us some feedback in terms of that follow-up email, that will give us an opportunity to work out whether we're talking about this in the best possible way for people to understand the choices you're about to have, and also to make sure if there are questions we didn't cover in today's presentation, that you will be able to do that. So thanks everybody for your time. We'll wrap it up now because we wanted to wrap it up within the half hour, and we'll please take the time to respond to that email when you get it later today.